Thanks everybody for coming and for your stamina. I thought I was going to be basically in this room by myself. After 2 days of, I think, pretty intense conversation, and for those who've joined us, I think it's a moment actually to celebrate, I think, a lot of the things, the hard work that the students and the staff have done. My name is Theodore Spyropoulos. It's Graduate Open School Open Day, and I really do have a privilege in sort of working with a lot of really talented people at the Design Research Lab. And I think, honestly, we have a lot of kind of anniversaries of sorts, and it's been a little bit nostalgic with some dear colleagues that are also leaving the program. So in a strange way, that has been a moment of a lot of self-reflection within the context of the DRL and within the context of the larger AA community. These conversations are also being expanded to consider, I think, the possibilities of what the future of a lot of these things actually are, and actually how we conduct as a community a conversation about actually what that vision statement could be. I also feel a debt of gratitude, I think, for our critics, because we ask a lot of them. They come here for 2 days and they're sort of immersed from 10 o'clock, if not earlier, till around 6 o'clock, really engaged, I think, in a lot of different projects and a lot of our sort of ongoing debates, and they really help to shape, I think, a lot of the discussions and the things that we take forward with the next generation. And so for that, I really need to thank Tom and Luciana and Marcus and Ariane, and I mean, the list just kind of goes on and on. And I think for that, actually, we've always been very fortunate to have people that really want to participate. And the nature of the conversation that I'd like to have with you today is about experimentation and participation. And I think it's fundamentally to do with a certain motivation about why it is that we do what we do, who we do it for, and how we can sort of evolve that project into something that actually has a meaningful influence. Architecture for me is an amazingly complex, paradoxical kind of endeavor. On the one hand, it's full of optimism. On the other hand, it's amazingly difficult on all aspects of basically how we conduct our everyday. I want to speak about the conversation about not only the DRL, but the AA as something that is an evolving experiment. David Green basically put forward, I think, a conversational topic when we came here in the fall about speaking about if experimentation is important, if it matters, and then what value does that have actually for the community to sort of explore that in all of the different ways that that could be engaged in, right? How can we ask more informed questions about what it is that we're really discussing? And this book, actually, I was sort of targeted to by John Fraser, who mentioned James Gowan, and the title of this book, A Continuing Experiment. And it's part of, I think, one of these evolving projects. When we speak about experimentation, I think the AA at the heart of it is an experimental, prototypical kind of endeavor in its ability, I think, to bring people together to really engage, debate, and construct, I think, what the future of discourse, future of design, the future of making actually is, but not with this idea of science fiction, but a form of science fact that is actually materialized. We live in radical times, and I think that the idea of what a belief system actually is and what motivates people, I think, is really important. And in the book, I was really struck by an article that Warren Chalk from Archigram put forward, and he said that there is a space between the individual idea and idea shared by a collection of individuals that may only be understood through participation. And I think at the heart of it, that's what the DRL actually is. I came to the DRL from New Jersey as a little kid. I guess at the time I was 23, 22. And I got to really engage with people like Patrick and Brett and Andrew Benjamin at the time, Tom Verabus. And part of that kind of ongoing conversation and the community that was forged out of that, I think, started to really put forward a project which wasn't singular, but it was plural and collective and shared. And at the time that we had our 10th anniversary, which was in 2008, we had this cover of AJ, which basically asked the question, what planet are they from? As a way of sort of sitting uncomfortably about what it is that we actually do and what the motivation behind it is, but at the same time recognizing that the DRL in a certain way was not really an academic model. It was really a strategy towards working and sort of supporting, I think, practice in a way of sort of prototyping ideas and exploring and experimenting on things that actually could find form in practice, in new ideas of what practice could be, in research, in universities, and in education. And I think a lot of the things that are really important to me are motivated, I think, by this idea of trying to understand what this expanded idea of what architecture could be. And I say that because I think architecture in itself makes demands that are very particular, and we have to support that. Hollein basically said that a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of the traditional building will enter the realm of architecture, as architecture and architects will have to enter new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. And for me, this kind of spirited conversation, I think, is really important. When we consider what happens to these students afterwards, architecture in a traditional building sense and practice is one way, but potentially what's coming to the foreground, I think, is really how architectural thinking and design thinking actually permeates all aspects of life. And I'm someone who's very unapologetic about that belief that design matters. I really don't give a shit about people who trivialize design, who believe that generic ideas are just okay and acceptable. I really think it's important, and I think you see that in the work of a lot of the students that come to the AA. They want more, they demand more for people. This isn't for themselves. And I think that that's one of the things that makes me quite optimistic. When it comes to the AA, I also think that it is a cultural project. When we look at the things that define the AA for what it is, I do think it's unique in the world, and it's the reasons that we came here. For a lot of us in the audience, we didn't really know what this place was. I can speak very honestly. I was probably the most ill-informed, most naive person to possibly come here. I just had a belief that some of these people that I was very curious about either studied here or taught here. And so I thought it was something worth sort of coming over to sort of find out. And that wasn't an easy decision. I'm not a rich kid or any of that stuff. But when you see images like this is outside our door. This is Alvin Boyarsky on an elephant. And you could try to rationalize that or find logic, but I just think it's pretty interesting. And this is Alvin Boyarsky, and I'm not going to do a kind of nostalgia for 60s or 70s either. But I sort of preface this with a certain idea that it is about a community, and it's not necessarily this kind of idea of an iconic figure. It's about people, and people sort of working together in a community, and you'll may or may not recognize Bernard Schumi next to him. But there were a lot of characters at that period of time. And if you fast forward, I think, past the 60s and 70s, when you look at the 80s, when you look at Ben Van Berkel here and Farshid and all of these other characters, and then you go, I was a 90s boy here at the late 90s. But if you look at people like Akim and Neri, Oxman, and you look at a lot of other people that have been coming through the school, generations after generations, I think are part of the process and are very much coming out of the discourse and the debate that actually happens here. When we talk about the heydays of the AA, we kind of get a little bit teary-eyed about that stuff. And I think to think about the AA in isolation is to sort of misunderstand, I think, a much bigger project. And part of that actually was born out of a certain kind of questioning of how technology actually pervades our lives. So this is the Architecture Machine Group. This is Nicholas Negroponte graduating from M.I.T. and a couple years later starting a lab that actually really didn't have a premise other than there were these technologies of CAD systems and speculating, well, how would that actually change the role of the architect? At the same time, you had artists and engineers, this is EAT, Experiment for Art and Technology, coming together without a purpose that was so explicit in the beginning, but with this kind of motivating factor of bringing people together and seeing what could happen. And this is their seminal project for the Osaka Expo, which was large-scale fog sculpture that influenced Diller and Scafidio's Blur building, 100 artists, engineers, and other characters coming together and converging on one project, which was called the Pepsi Pavilion at the time. When I consider, I think, certain things that have been influential to me, I think I see the AA as part of a conversation with schools like SCI-Arc and Cooper Union, and I also see the generosity of a lot of the people that are there. So when I go to LA, we'll see Tom Ray Cappe, who's a founder of SCI-Arc, will open up his house and we'll have this kind of setting talking about architecture. And I think the discourse of architecture, and it's one of the reasons why we make this a very open event, is to really open the conversation, and I think it's much more needed now than ever in terms of those discussions. But to understand that this has always been a part of what this place has been. If you have people like John Fraser and Cedric Price and Gordon Pask and students that may not be well known, but for sure were seminal in terms of the development of some of these ideas. And if we look in the DRL studio, to be honest with you, this stuff happens every day as it happens in unit spaces and pretty much everywhere else. I think the difference of some of the things today, though, is that we are burdened with this idea that somehow these ideas are maybe not much a part of the world that we're actually operating and living in. So when we consider stuff like in the 70s, people usually talk about utopia or dystopia or anytopia, whatever. But realistically speaking, at the Osaka Expo, you had people prototyping these things and using it as a way of sort of communicating and making accessible through the act of making, prototyping ideas and putting them out there in the world. And at that time, to be honest with you, it served more than a proof of concept. It served actually as a convergence of bringing people together. So here you'll have Moshe Safdie, you have Yona Friedman, you have Dennis Crompton from Archigram, you have a whole series of characters like Hans Hollein coming together to discuss actually what, at the time, the way that we talk about it is the avant-garde, but realistically speaking, it was a generation of architects that actually demanded more. And I think that's actually really important and maybe something for our students and for the youth of today. Moshe Safdie is still most famous for his project that he did as a thesis, which he built as Habitat. So I guess the motivating factor, I guess, from my conversation today as a conclusion of these events is really that architecture has to participate, has to engage within the information-rich environments that are shaping our lives and construct frameworks that allow for change and embrace the unknown. There are a lot of things today that are uncertain, and there are a lot of things that obviously we have to find better ways. To do that, though, I think we have to really start to be more explicit about what it is that we actually do and how our knowledge actually pervades, I think, many different disciplines. I really am a believer of that the models that are going to operate today can't be fundamentally driven by ideas of the past. They can be revisited. They may actually resonate much more today than in the time that they were sort of put forward. But we have to not consider them as blueprints for our future or for today. When science fiction has become fact, architecture today has to move beyond representation, beyond the fixed and finite tendencies that declare what architecture should be and work what it could be. Now, we could debate this stuff, and we have, and I think that these are open kinds of questions. But when we consider the school in this particular moment, this was also the school. This was also the AA. This is also front members' room. This is also front members' room. And this was an experiment at the time when Mohsen Mostafavi was a dean here, who basically just paired up two kids that just started teaching at the DRL, Vasilis Strumpakos and myself, with one of the stronger units here, which was David Greens from Archigram and Shin Egashira. And we took over the school in a certain way, did this thing called electric timber, and this was basically 5 months into the term. We took a whole dump truck of wood chips, we filled basically a reflection pool, kids were making stuff all over the place, and the building became an infrastructure to sort of test ideas and to open those ideas up. And when we consider the role of how the school as a prototype actually operates, we start to understand, I think, much more some of these kind of images of, to be honest with you, someone like Zaha Hadid, who has always championed this place. Every interview she kicked off by basically saying how influential coming to London and actually coming to the AA and working with the people here influenced her. And to be honest with you, nobody commanded this space, if I can just sort of tip my hat to her, as she did. I mean, Patrick had his symposium here, we had Wolf Pricks and Eric Owen Moss, we had all of these other kind of rock star-like figures, but to be honest with you, nobody, Rem, no Bjarke, no nothing, actually commanded this room like she did. And to be honest with you, I think London lost someone that actually was really a true optimist about design. And I think that that is something that can't actually really be forgotten. So that's something that, to be honest with you, I always really appreciated, because she would sit in a jury like this today. She didn't have the time to do that, but she would come at least for one project or two projects. She would come for the end of term jury or the end of term exhibition. And I think that this is actually really important, because it's not so much that she came here, but it's the motivation behind the reasons why she would. To support a community, I think, is really important. And it's about these generations actually coming together, not necessarily because she was in the room, but actually because of the next generation of work that was being put out there in the world. I always am humbled, and continue to be so, when actually you see the amount of people that come into this space and fill this space to actually see the work of their colleagues, to see the work of other students, to come from down the street or come from somewhere else, and to understand that they're part of a much bigger kind of project, which is a kind of contemporary project for architecture. And to be honest with you, that has always had a role in practice. I remember my time when I finished from the AA, I went to Eisenman's office, and when I moved back to London, I joined the office for one project, had the opportunity to do one of the first 3D prints there at the workshop at Zaha Hadid's, had the opportunity to really sort of participate. My experience is, to be honest with you, very normal. The conversation of how practice and schools like the AA and the Bartlett and East London and all of these things were always a very active dialogue between these things. And I think we have a lot of challenges moving forward in terms of how we can sort of resist some of the things that politically are starting to stifle that. But when you look at actually who's a tutor and who's a student, or who's teaching who, what I always really found really important within the DRL is that we're all sort of working on the same project without any kind of hierarchy. When we had the 10th anniversary, we tried to sort of map that out. We tried to do diagrams to explain every person and every nationality and all of that stuff. And maybe the diagrams were cute, but at the heart of it, it actually didn't actually touch on the things that actually motivated that kind of convergence in the first place. And Warren Chalk kind of continued in his article, and it's called People, Robots, and Trees, and I find it actually even more so interesting in terms of the conversation that we've had over the last couple of days. But he said that there's a deficiency of words, symbols, and visual information, and that they cannot communicate experience from one person to another. We can agree to agree, but there remains only mutual incomprehension. You only know what you like, or like what you know. There's this desperation for trying to communicate, to reach some understanding of one another's experience and preconceptions. We must submit and cause and effect to a higher contradiction. We must construct a living paradox, able to recognize conflict without emotion. The experience of what is without naming it brings the freedom of what is. And I think that this is actually pretty interesting relative to the conversation that we had today. We can name things and try to classify things, but at the heart of doing that, there are also certain things that are not necessarily captured within this. And I state that because I think that the plurality of how a collective, almost intelligent body of people working together on problems, I think do and has demonstrated a capacity to do a lot more than just put some ideas in the world. And I'm also reminded, I think, of generations of people that have come through the AA and the DRL, and specifically I'll speak about right now, who were students of ours, of Patrick's, of mine, of Brett's. So for example, the top left is Mr. Stuart Smith and Jota and Diego. On the right is Sajay Bhushan, and on the left bottom is Pierre Andrea with their teammates. And as part of this kind of continuing thing, which I always valued something about the AA and the DRL, which gave people, youth, chance. And I say that because I was one of those guys. So I started teaching here when I was 24 years old. And if I had gone back to New Jersey or to New York, I'm pretty sure that that wouldn't have happened. But it wouldn't have happened for a lot of reasons that actually potentially aren't really that important to begin with. And so one of those things, and I was obligated by Brett to show a slide of my DRL project. This is 1999. Excuse, it's not as super cool as everybody else's. But it's mine, with my colleagues Jean and Marcus, and a colleague who passed away, Masato Ashiya. So in the DRL, to be honest with you, as much as we are motivated in terms of making things happen, we have amazing challenges. I keep bringing up the 10th anniversary because we've entered our 20th anniversary and the conversation is up for debate about what it actually means. And I'm not really sure yet. But at the 10th anniversary, it was very clear that we needed to demonstrate the capacity to bring the community together through design. And so we held a competition, and Patrick worked, I think, very diligently with Reader. Yusuke Obuchi helped to fabricate and to make this thing, and AKT gave us 40 iterations of a competition that was won by Alvin Huang and Alan Dempsey, two graduates who were working at Amanda Levette's. And through this project, actually, they took the courage to set up their own practices after that, and both are doing actually very well, one in London and one in LA. The project, I think, was really important because the techniques were actually familiar, but the actual demonstration of what it meant to actually do that was a really important thing. This is about constructing, I think, fundamentally a better understanding of what it is that we're trying to do and how we go about doing it. And to understand this, this wasn't a studio or a year where the whole school of the DRL was just sort of working to facilitate that project. This was the kind of after hours project. And some of our students, to be honest with you, really didn't like us. And to be honest with you, we probably didn't really like ourselves when we took the endeavor of holding the largest exhibition that the school ever had. Both galleries, pavilion outside, publication of the first 10 years. We were very motivated with taking stock of actually what had happened. We asked, where did our graduates go? We tried to understand what they did and how they went about doing that. The offices that they moved to work at, the practices that were generated out of that, and some of them actually were amazingly decorated in what they have. Built a hell of a lot more buildings than I had. An office in Slovenia called Office, OFIS. I mean, they're like on a world domination tour in Europe. And then you had one of the partners of M.I.T, Yusuke Hayano, winning a large competition in Canada that sort of blasted them off into something else. And at the time, kind of interesting, but Ma Yon-song was my intern at Eisenman's when I was there. And then I moved to Zaha for this one project, and he sat next to me, actually looking at competitions to do when he was leaving Zaha's office. And it's kind of strange, but what motivates that, I think, is really a deeper understanding of a larger kind of practice and a larger kind of cultural project. And here sometimes, when we were in this kind of situation where also our head of school, our head of program at the time that was co-directing with Patrick, Brett, was moving forward to put himself forward for the directorship here, we did some strange stuff to try to kind of put our minds on something else. So what did we do? We did an exhibition. We basically said we're going to roll 500,000 paper cones and make a structure out of it. And we did, and the cheapest exhibition that we've done, I think it's less than $50, to be honest. But at the same time, it was just kind of like recursively just working through some things. And when I think about some of the things that we did, we probably didn't know what we were doing when we started it. But when I joined the DRL and joining these guys who were decorated in their own right, I was just a little Greek kid from Jersey, and Vasilis had come from Patras, and we were basically being asked to communicate a certain kind of legibility of something that they were calling responsive environments, which really was the kickstart of a lot of questions that were really important to me. And my return to London was also in parallel with my brother, Stephen. And that's where we started Minimaforms. And in a strange way, moving in parallel, somewhere between trying to set up practice and trying to participate in this kind of strange world of design research was amazingly influential. And so these were experiments that we were doing with Nick, basically making wearables and VR things, you know, and if I was pretty smart and Vasilis was pretty smart, we would have patented this a long time ago. And then Oculus Rift would owe us some money. But I mean, we were doing these kind of experiments at the end of year shows, making things like wearables and having augmented kind of vision systems, and Nick would parade around and we would get almost arrested in Trafalgar Square. And we set up exhibitions where we tried to look at space as an interface. So this is, you know, our end of year show at the DRL in the front members room, that same room that I showed you with the carpet and the funny chairs. And we said, okay, what happens if the floor was actually a tangible interface? And so we looked at old security systems and we made the floor with all these touch pads that would trigger different lights and models and some of the kinetic stuff that was shown in an exhibition called Latent Utopias. What it opened up also was a kind of interrogation of what representation actually was and what was meaningful information and how do we use that actually in a way to take, I think, a certain kind of attitude towards what design actually's greater purpose is. So we were doing drawings like this as wire diagrams, and at the same time working on those wire diagrams to sort of embed that within the studio, using the studio and the building as an infrastructure. And at the end of the day, it was laborious, and it probably wasn't the smartest way to go about things, but it was our way. And to be honest with you, that's the only thing that really mattered. Because one of the things about actually doing design research is that you will accept that there is failure as part of the process, but you're not going to accept failure as the end result. At the end of the day, the exhibition had to happen. At the end of the day, I felt so much responsibility. This was really the reason that I left Zaha's office in the first part. Because Brett asked me to do the exhibition with Vasilis, and we were here, and we wanted so much to participate in the community in something that actually gave some added value to a lot of the research that was being developed by the students. And I think that desire has remained. In the context of a lot of the stuff that we talk about, I always talk about this word behavior, and I really do think at the heart of things, if whole lines, words could be sort of mangled today for something that I would believe in, I would say that all is behavior. And if we understand this world, I mean, this was the iconography of the bow issue that he used. He's also the kind of character that said, basically, we don't need architecture, we just need better drugs. So these were obviously statements that had to be taken with a kind of grain of salt. But at the same time, I think there were provocations. And I think what's changed in many ways is about trying to make things shared and accessible. And I think that that's the spirit, what I think the DRL is really important and can contribute, I think, to a bigger conversation, is that these things are developed in teams and communication is facilitated on a daily basis. I think what's also important is that these endeavors don't become academic. And I think I try really hard as much as I can with the limits that I have with my brother and with my colleagues, and some of my students help out, to also prototype some of these ideas, to actively work on these things, to try to explore what robotics could potentially be. What for me is emotive may not be the same as what my students' idea of emotive is, but it's part of a larger project, and I see it part of a family of where research and projects and practice and all of these things are really part of a deep ecology, and they have to be if we are going to make any sort of meaningful kind of progress, and if we're able to actually contribute and make accessible to a general public that usually is dumbed down in terms of how we communicate to them. And the funny thing about doing projects like this is a project that I did with Stephen and Apo and Manu and some other colleagues, called Petting Zoo, is, you know, you get articles like this that are reviewing shows like at the Barbican, at Digital Revolution, which was the most attended show in Barbican. And it situates itself historically between Pong and Gravity and all of these other kinds of stuff. And then you get Wired magazine and it starts talking about this thing, a bizarre petting zoo where robots replace animals. And then you get interviewed by Russian TV. And you have a 6-hour interview, and you're doing a lot to try to communicate what's really going on, right? So I'm going to play that video, right? Okay. So I'm pretty sure that you guys don't understand this, and neither did I. But I had a Russian student, Sergey, and I asked him if he could translate it for me. And so maybe my Russian friends in the audience can correct me, but the story goes a little bit like this, right? Theo and Stephen have been in London for 15 years, and they've never been to the zoo. So they decided that they'll build their own zoo. Theo and Stephen also believe that animals shouldn't be in cages, so they prefer to put robots in cages instead. And then when discussing the kind of emotive aspects of what it is that it's doing, said, well, you have to be really careful if you misbehave. And okay, the only thing that I really got was proletariat capitalist and some other kind of stuff. And I was thinking, like, what is this all about? And so it's like, if you behave nicely, it behaves nicely to you. And if you misbehave, well, you're in trouble, but in more forceful words. It ends basically with a woman who's the interviewer taking one of the components that we designed out in Bedford Square, and she starts walking with it. And she comes back 45 minutes later, right? Yes, it does get that crazy, actually. And so she says basically in the video, I hope architects like Theo and Stephen in the future will not just design animals, but will design people too. And her disclaimer when she came into it to return it to me is like, I really hope that it's softer, Theo. So a lot of the kind of soft stuff has definitely been a response to, I think, some of this kind of stuff. And so with my brother and with my colleagues, we question things like this. And one of the things that I think has been really important to us, maybe I'll wait for her to walk because it's pretty monumental for me anyway. One of the things that's been really important is that projects, to be honest with you, sort of make demands. And I say that because, I mean, like, me and Stephen never decided that we were going to go and make a robot project. And just like every project, somehow between the situation, the conversation, and the context, projects kind of emerge. And I think what I've always felt very fortunate about, and we'll leave her alone for a sec, is being in a conversation where we could sort of just say that anything is possible if we sort of are committed to sort of figuring that out, right? And for us, maybe one of the most important projects that we ever did was something that we did in Trafalgar Square called Memory Cloud. And all we basically thought about was this idea of communication and animating the built environment through really people speaking through something, right? And so I'll show the project at the end, but at the heart of it was, could we construct an interface that was completely ephemeral? We were doing machines and doing all of this heavy stuff, and we said, could it be completely dematerialized? And we've been practicing for as long as I've been here, so let's say 15 years. And a lot of that stuff was free-form experimentation, and I agree with a lot of the conversations that that has to be formalized and it has to be targeted, and projects actually make those demands in certain ways. But one of the things that was a consequence of a lot of these kind of projects was also at the same time, always I've been working on, let's call it a PhD. I just call it trouble, which was about situating the work. And I think Tom was very right about situating it within a discourse. Sometimes, to be honest with you, though, I don't always think that architecture is that discourse. And and I speak only for my project with my brother and some of the people that have worked with us, looking at systems as not something that is kind of generic and default and trying to use them as ways to interface and instrumentalize, I think, certain enabling features for people in particular have always been really important. And part of that, then you start to sort of open up a conversation and you start to see people like Rodney Brooks, and you start to learn about Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, and you know about Architecture Machine Group, and you start to discover stuff. And that's an interesting moment because on the one hand, just like Frei Otto is for a lot of the material research, it's like, oh shit, pretty much everything's been done. I could just go home and just call it a day. But at the same time, actually, it was done at a very particular time, and doing it today actually resonates in a really different way. And Rodney Brooks put something out there, especially in the context of my studio. It's going to be harder to distinguish what's alive and what is machine, and that boundary may start to become meaningless. And I really do think that that's a very interesting thing, and it's part of the premise of a lot of the stuff that we're looking at. But also part of the premise is a sort of limitation, and there is a conceptual project, and I guess maybe some of the things that I understand, rightfully so, are always discussed as technical. I would prefer using the word conceptual, but using the medium in a very different way. So if you look at someone in the 70s like Joseph Kosuth, he was trying to talk about this paradox. He says, chair, chair, chair. They all fit the definition of what the language, the word actually means. So if it's in the definition of it, if it's in the object, or if it's in the representation of it, they all fulfill the limitation of, let's say, the English language idea of what chair actually is. But in a moment, and that's not a really good moment. Damn it, Raphael D'Andrea. Okay, let's try this again, huh? Otherwise, you're just going to be listening to me talk. Let's see. In a moment where we say that chair is chair, and this is the work of Raffaello D'Andrea, what does it really mean when the chair itself has its own agency? Does that definition need to be expanded even further? If recognizing something, is that really enough? And does it really sort of tease out a lot of those kind of features that we're talking about? And I think Tom also was mentioning that. I would only make the argument, or sort of expand that a little bit further, that sometimes working through, I don't want to use the word technologies because it sounds like all we like is gadgets, but working through the technique, the art of bringing this forward, if you take the root of that thing, I think is really fundamental. And I think it ties itself back to a much larger cultural project. And it also ties itself back to a thing that words or statements like this in the news and the media doesn't shock anybody anymore. Future of tech, robot designer, babies. And this is CNN money. This isn't, like the wacky stuff, let me show the petting zoo of Minimaforms. This is basically about industries that are basically being driven by that. And if you look at the kinds of things that people are doing, and this is Hiroshi Ishiguro from Tokyo, who's been working on some of the most cutting-edge robots, right? But it's targeted with creating himself. And this kind of really weird, uncanny valley conversation is actually getting so close in a certain way because he's a bit mechanical Japanese and the bot is a little bit more behavioral. It's very strange. But if you listen to the cultural bit, if we could turn the volume up a little bit, it's interesting from an Eastern perspective. Can we put the volume up higher?
Inspired by Japan's unique spiritual beliefs, they are blurring the boundaries between humans and robots.
It's a question of where the soul is. Japanese people have always been told the soul can exist in everything and anything. So we don't have any problem with the idea that a robot too has a soul.
Okay, we can leave it
We
there.
don't make much distinction between humans and robots.
That's his belief. But I think it's interesting to think about how he speaks about it from a much more cultural perspective. That things themselves doesn't necessarily need to be robots. Potentially, he calls it soul, we could call it agency, we could use a lot of different words. But I think one of the things when it comes to a kind of technologically enabled project that becomes problematic, particularly in discourse, is also setting up these kind of very precarious situations, right? So this is Lee Sedol, who was working to play Go against AlphaGo. And this kind of first game, almost like the chess machine kind of things, who's going to win, man or machine, set up like if it was a boxing fight or MMA fight or whatever, sets up a kind of very strange paradox, like it's an either-or situation. And this guy who is obviously brilliant, felt such a disrespect, such an emotional baggage on him, because he lost the first time, and then he thought, well, maybe I just didn't prepare enough. And so he played the second time, and he lost again, and then he felt that his emotions and his human aspect of playing was influencing his performance. Then he lost a third time. It wasn't recognized that you have thousands of computer scientists mapping every single kind of move that you possibly could do in real time, that conversation is actually pretty mute. If it's just about robots taking over the world, or if it's just about playing the computational expertise, I think that this is really not the interesting question today. I think if you do look at today, like talking about machine learning 10 years ago is very different like talking about it now. Now everything is machine learned and everything is AI and everybody's cool with it, except the people that are doing it. So if you have people like Elon Musk, he's going to say that the way AI is being done is problematic because it takes a lot of assumptions and it's predicated on what we know. If you look at stuff like a Roomba, which is probably one of the most simplistic little robots, which is Rodney Brooks cashing in, you start to see that they have their own agency. They see the world, the left is a Roomba, the right is a knockoff version of it, in different ways. And so what does it mean when those things actually do have their own capacity? The conversation has always been very active when we talk about it with autonomous cars, but it's also sort of problematizing this kind of argument if it's top-down or if it's bottom-up, if it's generative, if it's total control parametric. It really is such a time dependency and has to be having a dexterity to sort of address this kind of real-time nature of the necessity of how these systems are deployed in the world today that I think it becomes amazingly interesting, because I really do believe, and I think a lot of the people around me do as well, that these are also fundamentally spatial problems. This isn't just about computing. And that's why I think it's also a certain kind of argument beyond computation. There is something else at play here. And there's decision-making and ethics, and there's a really complex series of conversations that are born out of this. But this was 2 years ago. The UK was one of the prototyping places, just like San Jose and so forth, for deploying these kind of cars. And then you had people like at M.I.T. under Bill Mitchell that were also exploring the vehicle. And they were talking about it, and it was like almost like a push cart, a little bit slightly more collapsible. In the DRL, in a very similar way, and I think this project next to the one that was just presented is kind of interesting because the subject of scale is actually discussed, and scale actually comes with a very different thing, but also the problem that motivates its deployment actually is important too. And this was where we started in terms of this self-aware, self-structuring strategies, and we were looking at mobility as something fundamental, but we targeted basically single occupancy vehicles and shared strategies. And we coupled that with problems of congestion and parking, and we said, well, if we had a distributed system, could we deploy it within the city and actually use it as a space-making facility instead of a space-filling facility? And some of those questions are not things that just come up like with a brief. And other things are discoveries when you actually make a prototype and you start to play around with it, that play is actually a really serious endeavor. Within design, I think we sort of try sometimes to overly explain, while fundamentally I think we just have to discover and actually develop these kind of proof of concepts which allows you to see what you want to see. Like the Mies quote that I used in the beginning, we fundamentally do see what we want to see, and I agree that we have our own observer principles and we sort of project that onto the world, but like in a cybernetic second order kind of discourse, if everybody's observation of the world is their own, then we have to construct a kind of new framework to kind of understand what the implications of that is. And so if you look at people like Walter Gray Walter actually making autonomous robots in the 50s, he wasn't making the robots to demonstrate robotics, he was making it to talk about simple interconnected systems like in neurology, like how the brain works, could be communicated through these kind of things. And so now let's see if DeAndrea works again. The quadricopter, the drone, and so forth, this is the work of DeAndrea and his research at ETH, and I think it's really interesting. And this is a proof of dexterity that it could juggle. But I also find it really interesting to see that it could juggle with a person, or it doesn't really need the person at the end of the day either. The capacity for these things to actually real-time engage and respond is interesting, except it also comes with a very, very particular challenge, which is in a constrained environment, totally controlled, totally encapsulated in terms of vision, that works perfectly. Outdoors, that system doesn't work at all. And so we may look at certain things and think that these are familiar things and we should be able to do all of this stuff and we're really technologically advanced. But if we don't actually actively work on it, we don't really actually understand. It's not the nuances, it just doesn't work. And when you have companies like Amazon and other people working on it, I think it's really important to consider that aspect when we discuss a lot of these things. When we return to architecture and its role within that, I also think that's pretty fundamental. And my go-to example, which I think is the most straightforward of it all, is to say, when Negroponte started Architecture Machine Group, it was one group. It was not the strongest group. There was something called the Center for Advanced Visual Studies that were bringing people like Buckminster Fuller and Norbert Weiner and all of these characters. But this one, after 10 years of an experiment, of doing projects like this, which is throw gerbils in a vitrine, throw some reconfigurable blocks, but they're not self-aware and rotating. It had a mechanical crane that was moving it, and see what happens. The gerbils tried to escape, and a lot of them did. But the reality is these kind of experiments that were done as experiments, that opened up a very different question. And like a lot of the architects that we're talking about beyond building, these guys rebranded Architecture Machine Group, and Negroponte became basically the founding director of something called an M.I.T. Media Lab, which if you see that architecture was and maintained its participation in this world of communication, and fundamentally was a driving force of where research, particularly within a university or an institute, was being driven from, I think it's really interesting for the people sitting in the audience who are architects to actually see this as a reference that is actually meaningful. It actually did have an influence, and people do know the Media Lab, but they don't know it as something that was fundamentally an architectural problem to begin with. If we've seen the communication revolution happen, then the question is, okay, we still live in the physicality of what a world is. We may not operate fundamentally with it, and we've lost a lot of things because of it. And so to reintegrate that in the environments and the infrastructures and the buildings and the things that we're looking at, I think is a problem worth actually working on. And so Cedric Price, this is the most cliche quote now, which I almost want to take it out of my slide, but he really did say technology is the answer and followed it up. Fundamentally, what's the question? And so I think the only way that we sort of get to advance these things and don't fall into this kind of default conversation about what things actually are is to kind of unpack this and to do events like this and to fill spaces like this with a really meaningful kind of sharing of design. It's different to kind of come together, sit at the bar and just have a chat session. And it's another thing about bringing a project and really trying to converse through motivation, through design, through representation, through the tools that it is that we're actually looking at. And in the DRL, we're always kind of caricatured as like the guys, the nerdy guys and girls who sit behind screens all the time, and we do that a lot. And Brett's really good at sort of poking fun at me, like we don't sort of let the kids out 7 days a week, and my students will be the first ones to tell you, if you have a chance, that yeah, we got to the school and Theo says we can't go anywhere, we have to be here Sunday. It's like, I don't say any of that stuff. Their teammates will say that to each other and they want to work on these things. And in the beginning, they don't understand why, but quickly it becomes much more apparent that this kind of work is not just about work. It's not a job. It's about a certain kind of purpose. It's how you actually think about the things that you do and what you do and with who you do it. And so many of us that have come to this place have found a lot of things at the AA, and to be honest with you, architecture was just one of them. And I say that because the relationships that we built here, I think, is also fundamentally important. And that's what I think is fundamentally different from people that graduate historically from the place, is that they do operate as a community. When we talk about communication, I know it's been a long day, so I'm not going to overly kind of keep you and all of that jazz. We talk about algorithms, and we somehow privilege algorithms as always having a very definitive kind of task and goal. This is probably the most generic of algorithms, infinite monkey theorem. It's stupid, it iterates, and it has a very clear task. Paint the Mona Lisa, communicate a phrase. And that same algorithm can be deployed in a different context. Play Super Mario Brothers. And through machine learning and through iteration, and even from the most stupidest thing, it can actually do a definitive problem with a degree of competency. And you say to yourself, like, okay, that's great. Machine learning is a solution for a lot of things. But it really doesn't work like that, because not a lot of problems are known. And I think that goes back to this concept of uncertainty and the unknown. And I think a lot of the things that we do is always this kind of negotiated space where we try to exhibit control when we know the design problem. And we try to allow for adaptive models when we understand that time is such a factor in terms of how these things are actually put out in the world. And when we look at a lot of these projects and these taxonomies, and in particularly in my studio, we're looking at these soft systems, it's also a certain understanding that we're really starting from nothing. We assume nothing. Fundamentally, in my studio particularly, we say that there are no blueprints and there are no master plans, and these things themselves are not things yet. And they get legibility through their ability to interact with other things. The thing itself isn't intelligent. It's its capacity to communicate and to collaborate with other things that makes it intelligent. And so maybe I'm slightly sensitive to this idea of system, because I particularly am not interested in mechanical things, and I'm not interested in this kind of industrial machine world. I'm actually not interested in robots either, but I can't really convince anybody, not after today and not after the last 4 years. But it's really about trying to discover, I think, something else, and to simulate that world is one thing, and then to try to make it, even if it's just to take a cube that inflates and to make it roll, is not easy. And what we don't talk about is how many failures led to the model that you may see on that table. And that goes for the foam stuff, that goes for our stuff, that goes for every studio. When we move beyond representation, the game changes. And I actually really feel that the game has to fundamentally change, because otherwise we're really spinning our wheels, like Patrick would say. And I always think that it's kind of really important, I mean, particularly as we came to a conclusion with this year, with some of these agendas in the form that they take. I mean, I went with my students to Boston to basically see their bio-robotics lab, and we went to see Hod Lipson, that's at Columbia, and I have to be really honest with you, and I know that this is recorded, but they weren't really impressed. And it wasn't like we were doing better things, but we were complexifying, I think, all of these different problems beyond engineering. And it's not like we weren't working technically, because these things have to work. And so you can make a model like that, but then when you try to automate that stuff, that changes the game completely. And then when you start to say, well, these things are not going to be locked in a configuration, it changes it again. And every time you introduce a new variable, the degree of failure is compounded in degrees of magnitude that you wouldn't actually really fully contemplate, or you wouldn't really try to understand, because you don't have the capacity to understand actually what it is that you're really trying to understand in the first place. And so we try to simulate these things. How do we control high populations? Well, okay, we had 8 units. What does it mean? You see the counter there. We're talking about 474 cells. Okay, that's a column. Is that really what we're trying to do? No. Okay, so what are we trying to do? Well, let's try to make a space. Let's try to make a little pavilion outside of the AA. How many components? Are we talking 1 million? Are we talking 2 million? Do those numbers matter? And this is the age that we're living in, where we actually don't really know what numbers really mean anymore. Something that's geared with specificity, like our deficit or any of these things, becomes so abstract that it really doesn't matter anymore. We know that things are, as we say in America, fucked, but we feel incapable of sort of participating in that. And I think that this is a real problem. And I say that because I really do miss the kind of blind optimism once in a while of at least putting some ideas out there. This is 1913 cover of Scientific America of what the promise of the city should be. promise of the city, if you look at it, is a three-dimensional interface, an infrastructure, buildings interconnected, underground, overground, flying machines. All of these things were not just illustrations, they were part of the promise. Well, what happens between promise and practice? That's something that you need to define, because you're contributing to that one way or the other. And I just lost this slide. Anyway, it was a nice slide. Imagine 2026 London, illustrated by the TfL. It's not here. I don't know why the slide just disappeared in front of me. But the slide basically shows a lot of London eyes. Where that the best that we could do in the city of the future for London is not even the reality of the towers that are being built, but actually the entertainment value of the things that become iconic, like the wheel. And if it's not that, it's this world. This world is a very strange world, right? Because it assumes everything, and it delivers nothing. And when people go back to these kind of visionary ideas, the idea of vision is always talked about in such a passé word today, like people don't want to design. But Kenzo Tange had a real problem, 8 million people. How do you design a project like that? It wasn't short of vision. It worked through a lot of these issues, but it had a problem of adapting to the changes that were happening. And so when we, within the DRL and with other people, are sort of problematizing some of these things, we say, well, okay, how can our computational tools offer us an adaptive way to deal with or to mitigate some of these changes? And those changes happen not only at the scale of master planning, which we hardly have any fully fulfilled master plan, but it happens daily on buildings, on program. And I think this kind of feature is very much a part of our day. And when we look at these kind of thoughts about what the smart city is and all of these things, architects are usually the ones that are the most cynical about these things. REM, for example, has been very clear about talking, the European Commission, that basically smart city is stupid. Okay? And it's not enough to say that stuff. It just isn't. When we look at how the city is operating and how Uber is operating and offering a very different problem of congestion, and when we look at all of the on-demand services that we actually have, you can't just say a statement like that. I mean, you can, and you could talk about the countryside, but to be honest with you, not today. I mean, maybe it works pretty well with a lot of people that just are kind of true believers in a certain kind of agenda, but for the young people today who are going to deal with the byproduct of urbanization, the way that it's being put forward, I think the challenges are there, and I think the idea of what practice is to speculate on those problems, I just think is also there, and needs new ideas and needs people that are willing to actually explore those things. And when I say about the technology aspect, it really is these characters also who are fundamentally putting out warning signs, but this isn't new. You could talk about Heidegger. Was he really so into technology, or was he so scared of it? You talk about McLuhan. Was he such a true believer, all of these things, or was he trying to build an understanding and to communicate those things? And the same thing is with these characters. I think it's been a pretty long day, and I'm not going to sort of keep you with any more kind of projects and all of that stuff, but I'll show a really short video of a version of things that we've been working on that's kind of driven by this interest of emotive. We did a project called Emotive City, which we showed at the Somerset House, which we took residency with my brother about 8 months ago. And the project was commissioned by an initiative, which is the Innovation Department of the UK. And it was put forward for an event called Future Fest. And Future Fest is basically, they bring in a series of experts to talk about the future of money, the future of democracy, the future of machines. And because of stuff like petting zoo and stuff like that, we were asked to talk about the future of machines. And we thought that we could talk about the speculative idea of our cities and infrastructure. And we took the concept of, well, what happens if we're not tied to infrastructure and we allow mobility to be part of our everyday life? So the emotive house is a mobile agent. The rules of interaction are built up collectively. Our everyday interactions are manifested in the behaviors of these things. And these things are temporary in the city, and they could migrate and move. We talked about this human-machine ecology, and we wanted to sort of explore some of that stuff. And we made these large models, and we tried to think about actually how these cells will communicate and compute. And to be honest with you, we probably don't have the capacity like some of our students to animate all of this stuff. But we did make these large kind of computable machines, developing strategies that Turing was talking about, speculating a little bit about actually what these self-organizational models for the city could be. When we showed the model, it was interesting because people thought that we want people to live in spheres. And I get this a lot. And I used to have a colleague who went so far as calling me Spyropoulos. But yeah, she's down the road now. But what we were also trying to do was to allow people to understand that they had the capacity to influence. So we made these phototropic bots, and we put them in the installation. And then we had their behaviors basically influenced by the Twitter feeds that were coming across. So we had things like hate and play and different degrees of actually having attractive or repulsion embedded within how these bots were communicating with each other. And we tried to express the idea because a lot of people felt that this was very controlling. Well, we're going to be in these machines that are going to dominate us. And we get it a lot. We get a lot of people kind of asking us if we really believe in the ethical values of being in machines. But it's because they see them as machines and they don't talk about it as house or home. And a house is not a home is not a house. This kind of discussion and debate was quite prevalent in the 70s. And you had people like Rainer Banham sort of problematizing that. We used that kind of reaction diffusion as a strategy to sort of express that. And the initiative that we're part of in Somerset House, I think, is important because it was an initiative to bring arts and culture back into the City of London. And we were asked to basically take residency with other creative people, not creative like branding people, like we have authors, we have people that are fashion designers, we have different kinds of people. But at the opening of this exhibition also came the mayor. And I think what's really important about the mayor opening exhibitions, even like this, we had one of 6 rooms there, is really that there is an attention to see how creative people can come up with responses to, I think, really pressing challenges. There are obviously ecological challenges, environmental, but there's also congestion and living, and there's also things to deal with pollution and all this other stuff. And these aren't engineering problems anymore. This isn't like technical solutions that are just going to be attached to buildings like solar cells. This is fundamentally having to restructure and to reconsider actually how we think about systems in the first place. And I think this idea of living is a very important one. And it was fundamental, I think, to people like Warren Chalk. And I think, to be honest with you, it's fundamental to me. I think that all of the things that we're actually exploring collectively as a community really needs to actually make a much more influential and much more participatory way of sort of engaging the everyday. We are sort of becoming obsolete by the fact that we don't sort of engage people, we don't communicate these ideas, we don't take these things outside and really try to have those conversations that are needed. It's not going to happen as a project pitch. It's going to happen by continuously having these engaged conversations and bringing people together, which what I think architects do really well. We may not know anything really well, but when it comes to space as a medium, I think this kind of abstract concept has a lot of resonance, and it's part of a lot of the challenges that we're facing. And so I'm going to conclude today, and I know there's a lot of conversations about what the future of this place is, and I think the future of this place is what we want it to be. And the conversations that are going to happen in terms of what it should be, I think should be open and spirited, but it also should have some confidence in its capacity to actually take its decisions and to recognize a community that's actually here. And so I think that this is really important coming from me because I've been through this process once before. And usually the conversation starts with a kind of shopping list of greatest hits of people, and usually the names are always the same. And to be honest with you, fundamentally, I'm not really from that world. I'm nobody. Maybe you're nobody. But to be honest with you, Boyarsky was nobody too. And the only reason that he's somebody known is because he was part of a community that he built a framework for. He couldn't do that. He's not the enabling agent. It's about the community that was there, that was migrating like an attractor and was given a space to actually do something. And with doing something in front of the community, and I think that that's something that SCI-Arc actually does really well, about people coming to lectures, of their colleagues, of the people that are coming. You know, this space should be filled all the time. And it's not. And I think that this stuff, we have to actually be a little bit much more self-reflective as we move forward. And, you know, there are a lot of challenges for a place like this to begin with, but the same could be said of Cooper Union, and the same could be said of SCI-Arc. There's no guarantee. That motivation has to be something that's spirited and ongoing. And I believe, not so much in institutions, but by people. And so I think that that kind of aspect is something that everybody should sort of consider as they sort of participate in this conversation. And that that's not necessarily solely about just the AA community that's here, but that resonates, I think, with a much bigger community of how architecture can really sort of engage today. I really am unapologetic about that. And I've kept you in a really hot room, and a lot of you guys have been here for 2 days, and I'm sure all of you want to go to the bar and get some dinner, and it's Friday night. So I'm really, really thankful that you guys gave me a platform. And I'm really thankful, actually, for all the people that came here today and really, I think, encouraged our students to actually believe that these things actually do have a meaningful future. But that's not easy. So I think this kind of speculation and having people together and seeing that and experiencing that for itself, I think, is really fundamental. So with that, I thank you, and I hope you guys have a good weekend. Sorry for our Phase 1 students and our Phase 2 students. We're going to have to move these models this weekend.